Lincoln Bloomfield has been there from the very beginning. He's been a friend dedicated to the commitment of human rights and to the protection and safety of the people of Camp Ashraf when they were at Camp Liberty and as well as at Camp Ashraf. He has written extensively about the plight of the people who have joined MEK. He was involved in the court challenge to have the MEK delisted. He's someone who has been there as a pioneer with you, as a friend and a member of the family. Lincoln, please join us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And good day, everyone. I can't see very well, so I don't know whether it's morning or afternoon yet. I came here today to honor the victims of the September 1 massacre last year and their families and their friends. And I'm very honored to appear with senior distinguished American public servants who, as you've heard, served their country believing that they were reflecting the best of America, America's values, and America's role as the ultimate defender and guarantor of an orderly and just world in which human rights are respected and carried out. For many years as a policy official in the Pentagon and a little bit in the White House and in the State Department more recently, I worked on the Middle East quite a bit. I heard about the MEK, as did most professional policy people. We didn't really know what we were talking about. And then a few years ago, I examined the group a little more closely as a consultant and advisor to a Washington law firm that was advocating on behalf of a group of Iranian American citizens who wanted the MEK taken off the terrorism list. So I looked at what the experts in Washington said about this group. I went to Paris and observed, not as a speaker, just watched and asked a lot of questions about what I was hearing. I began to see that the common themes, the common statements, the common wisdom about the MEK in Washington, also known as the PMOI, and the political umbrella group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran in Paris, that what people said about them, and journalists as well, almost in a mantra-like fashion, the things they said about the MEK, the received wisdom, could not be squared with the facts that I was seeing. And so I began to dig more deeply, and I became very concerned, not initially about the Iranian diaspora or the people of Iran, but really about my own government and about whether we were operating on the basis of the truth, which is a pretty important question when you're trying to stop a nuclear breakout in the Middle East, for example, or to calm a region that is inflamed in turmoil, as we see today. I concluded that U.S. government accounts over the years, and I didn't see the classified accounts, but those were challenged by the attorneys to be brought to court, and the government was not able to produce classified evidence to the contrary. But the public accounts appeared to have been changed over time, tampered with, exaggerated, altered, and simply not squared with the facts. They did not reflect the fact that these are people who came to oppose the dictatorships of originally the Shah of Iran, who became brutally opposed to any political dialogue or any challenge from within, or the religious fundamentalist regime that took over in 1979. I heard a lot of things. I heard that this was a group that had killed Americans, but I learned that this was not the group that killed the Americans in the 1970s in Iran, that after the original political organization had been caught essentially planning some sort of a propaganda effort to turn the lights out in Iran during the Shah's 2,500-year anniversary, they were arrested, and dozens and scores of them were executed. And they went to the gallows essentially pledging their belief that Iran should be democratic. And Who knows who was left after the original 7 out of 8 MEK organizers were executed, Masoud Rajavi being the 8th. He was put in jail. So the ones that were left in the street heard the name Mujahedin. These were the brave people who lectured the military courts before they were sent to the gallows and stood their ground. This became respected among students in America and around the world. It created a reputation and a brand that the Mujahedin were brave people standing up against tyranny. And so others wanted to capture that name. And some of them wanted to do it with violence, and they murdered Americans, and they claimed the name Mujahedin, but they were not this group. I heard that they were Marxists, and they had a secret ideology that was sort of a blend of Marxism and Islam, and they were very anti-democratic. I found that they're not Marxists at all, that this was a label that the Shah cleverly attached to them as a way of demeaning them, and that Ayatollah Khomeini and his regime did the same, as a way of sort of poisoning their reputation with the West. The groups never had an office in a communist country. They've never used socialist rhetoric. I heard that they were a cult, that they were anti-family, that they were strange. And it might have been strange to see, for particularly a female New York Times stringer, to go to Camp Ashraf 20 years ago and see women driving tanks and sort of in the Muslim world, equal to men. As Patty just said, it's sensational in that it's so far out in front of the culture of the Middle East that it bears focus, the feminist dimension of this group. And what we found is that, as you heard from General Phillips and others, what's been written about the MEK, that these alleged human rights abuses, there's been a lot of allegations. There's no evidence, there's no credible evidence of any of it. And this has infected some important institutions. The Human Rights Watch, the RAND Corporation has a report which is tainted with evidence that cannot be verified. We heard that this is a group that supported the takeover of the American embassy, when in fact it was their political opponents who used the embassy takeover essentially to drive out any political opposition, including Prime Minister Bazargan, who was well respected by the Mujahedin. He quit as soon as the embassy was seized. This was clearly to the advantage of the mullahs. We heard that they terrorized the country after the Shah fell. That's not true. Madame Rajavi was a young woman, one of whose sisters had already been murdered in jail, another one soon to come, who ran for office and got 250,000 votes. Not too many of us can stand here. Some of them can, but I can't. I've never gotten 250,000 votes and never would. But she did. And Le Monde said that Masoud Rajavi, had he been allowed to run instead of having a secret fatwa calling for his death, would have gained millions of votes, including the support of all of the ethnic minorities, women, and religious minorities as well. We heard that they became a branch of Saddam Hussein's military, once ensconced at Camp Ashraf in Iraq. This is false. You can read the newspaper clippings at the time when they were allegedly brutalizing the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south in the spring of 1991. They weren't there at all. In fact, there were Iranian regime figures who were coming in under Mufti dressed as Kurds and creating atrocities. But this, again, is an allegation that, by the way, has never been verified by one scintilla of evidence captured after the takeover of Baghdad by American forces, where we got all of the hard drives of the regime. No one has ever turned up any evidence of these allegations. They're still repeated, however, in the media. We heard that these are dangerous, untrustworthy extremists. And yet, as you have heard, it's not just a recent position, the 10-point plan. These are people who have stood for a non-nuclear Iran, religious tolerance, anti-fundamentalism, gender equality, and they've meant it, they've lived it for 20 plus years, and democracy, going back not just to the days of opposing the Shah, but to the era of Mossadegh and his attempt to nationalize the oil and stand up against colonialism, and even back to the constitutional uprising of 1906. These are the roots of the Iranian resistance movement, and I'm not sure that Washington understands that. Even the State Department, in delisting the MEK in September of 2012, said They acknowledged there had been no violence by this group anywhere for a decade or more, and now that's a dozen years of only political activity, which makes you wonder, on what basis would we have a problem with a group that's engaged in political activity for a dozen years, and I'll say for much more of that. So you'll hear a lot about, and you have heard a lot about, American promises made to the residents. It's more, to me, than a case of our government being too preoccupied with other issues, and there are many issues preoccupying our leaders, or perhaps not energetic enough to deal with this one issue. I find it much more troubling than that. The promises that you heard our military officers talk about bound us by the Geneva Convention, and although I'm not a lawyer, I will stand on the advice of international law experts who say that this obligation that we undertook to protect the residents of then Camp Ashraf and later Camp Liberty only expires if you hand it off to another sovereign state who fulfills the obligation to protect them, in the absence of which the obligation remains with the United States. That is the case. There have been 7 attacks by the Iraqi state forces, and we continue to be legally bound to protect these people. American weapons and American-trained Iraqi forces have been used to kill members of the resistance in Iraq, and yet nothing has been done. And now you've heard about the inhumane conditions. All of us speaking here today have a simple message. The U.S. should use its authority to end this crisis. The administration is consumed with the new phenomenon known as ISIS, a self-proclaimed religious caliphate that terrorizes innocent people by saying, "Convert or die." The Iranian resistance has heard this before. In 1988, 30,000 people were told, "Renounce the MEK or die." They refused to renounce the MEK, and they were put to death in mass murders in 1988. Which is why the most disturbing aspect of America's treatment of these residents, more than the promises not kept, and more than turning a blind eye, is this demand that we are making as our government that they renounce the MEK as the price of coming to the United States. The general public has no idea that this is going on, but everyone in the region can see what Iran has done to the United States. They see that they've maneuvered us into a position of paralysis. They keep extending the nuclear talks without conceding anything. That paralyzes us in Syria and Iraq. We don't want to perturb the possibility of a deal. We are forsaking our own principles, our own laws, our international legal commitments, our written pledges, and the unarmed men and women who oppose dictatorship are paying with their lives. This may not be a media story, but Camp Liberty is America's second Abu Ghraib. It's a national disgrace. It's also an Iraqi disgrace, and Prime Minister Maliki, I think, has lowered the reputation of his country by becoming essentially a dictator and a partisan, a sectarian partisan. It falls to the new Iraqi Prime Minister right now to move the country toward unity. A lot is riding on what Ali Badi does. Through all of this, and my final word is that the resistance members have remained very composed, very focused, sad, never forgetting their fallen comrades, but they've unswerving in their belief that they'll see an end to tyranny in Iran. And these attributes, steadfast adherence to principle, unwillingness to trade their honor for convenience or safety, are at the heart of what they stand for. So I honor their sacrifice, and I only hope that we Americans can find the fortitude to face the true facts in the region, summon the strategic wisdom to stand on behalf of human rights and popular sovereignty in not just Iraq, but Syria and ultimately Iran, and fulfill our obligations to the residents of Camp Liberty by rescuing these deeply honorable people from certain death. Our country can reclaim our own honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lincoln.